Hi everyone, Deadly Tornado here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for another installment of Classics Week 2014, yay! And in this latest review here, we're going to be talking about Iron Maiden's Number of the Beast. Iron Maiden, English rock band, metal band, one of the most infamous and celebrated bands in heavy metal ever. They formed in the 70s but didn't actually release their full-length debut until 1980, which is when England began to see this new breed of heavy metal bands cropping up. And a great deal of these bands were underground and stayed that way, but nevertheless the sound that these bands brought to the table was pretty pivotal to metal's progression in this decade. Not too long ago, in the 70s, bands like Deep Purple and Black Sabbath had given metal a pretty great kick start. But still, the sound of Sabbath's and Purple's early work carried a lot of hard rock and blues influence, which even Sabbath itself would eventually strip away in the midst of its 80s output on albums like Mob Rules and Heaven and Hell, when the band was being fronted by vocalist Ronnie James Dio as opposed to Ozzy Osbourne. And Dio had just come over from fronting the band Rainbow for a few years, which was kind of a vanity project for Ritchie Blackmore of Deep Purple. So there were some pretty significant connections going on between the handful of very significant metal bands that there were around this time. Plus, I should also note that it's not like it's just 70s metal and then 80s metal. There were quite a few groups that thrived in both decades, like Judas Priest, for one, from the record Rock-a-Rolla in the mid-70s, which had quite a bit of blues influence on it, to their biggest and most notorious records in the 80s, like Screaming for Vengeance and British Steel, which had a more pure heavy metal sound. And then there was also Motorhead, who had a much gruffer style than their contemporaries at the time. And then when you consider underground groups like Venom, at this time, despite being such a young genre, metal had a pretty diverse array of voices. And across the pond, America was making the effort to contribute with groups like Blue Oyster Cult, and there was Alice Cooper too.
Hey, don't forget about my favorite hair rock band, Halen. The band Halen.
Yes, that album too. Sort of. So, late 70s, early 80s, metal is in a transitionary phase, as is Iron Maiden. Because before they can even put out a record, they are just picking up and dropping band members like jacks. The only person not dropping out is bassist Steve Harris, who has written the bulk of Iron Maiden's material over the years. Even though the band's songwriting process has become more collaborative as they've continued, much of Iron Maiden's early work can be attributed to Steve's compositional abilities. And there's also Dave Murray, who rejoined the band just in time to appear on every single Iron Maiden album, the only other member besides Steve who has done so. Still, maybe these years of evolution, formation, and reformation were a benefit, because by the time Iron Maiden came out with their first album, they had a pretty defined sound. The speed, the soaring guitars, the vocals that are harmonized but also delivered with quite a bit of swagger. They weren't quite the sleek performance studio machine that they would be later on albums like Power Slave, but a lot of the core elements of Iron Maiden's style were there. And the band would follow this album up with one of my favorite Iron Maiden records, Killers. However, with Paul Di'Anno on vocals, who actually wasn't a bad vocalist for Iron Maiden at the time, the band wasn't quite at that classic lineup that they're known for just yet, which is part of what makes Number of the Beast so significant, because they take one more step forward toward creating that classic lineup. Nico McBrain would join the band on drums later down the road, but here on this album is the first appearance of singer Bruce Dickinson, who previously had been singing for another English heavy metal band named Samson. And Bruce coming into the fold essentially helped Iron Maiden solidify that epic, grand, and kinda campy metal style that they're known for. And Bruce didn't just bring personality to the table, but a lot of technical ability too. The power and sustain of his voice. The range is fantastic. And you can tell that for him, singing is very much like acting as well. He really seems to ache over the expression and inflection of every single word, because a lot of the time Bruce is not just singing but telling a story. Right from the start of this record on the song Invaders, Bruce's voice is absolutely commanding. He sounds like a heavy metal General Patton getting his soldiers all whipped up for war, while also giving some very grim depictions of battle and the aftermath of. And even on a slow burner like Children of the Damned, the next track on here, which has a very gloomy opening but gets more intense progressively as the song plods along, Bruce sounds even more urgent and impassioned on this track, really making use of the space made by the slow instrumentation to create a very dramatic performance. However, there aren't too many slow moments on this LP, and that's partially because on this record, Iron Maiden starts to master the craft of the single by writing ever that would forever create ripples in the rock world that would make them one of the greatest bands of all time. The title track of this album, as well as Run to the Hills, which is one of the catchiest and also most sobering metal songs ever. When it comes to the cover art on this record, Iron Maiden, like a lot of other heavy metal bands around that time, newer heavy metal bands, were taking from some of the occult imagery and vibes that heavy metal bands and hard rock bands and traditional doom metal bands in the 70s were toying with. But bands like Maiden and Satan, too, were so much more straightforward with their blasphemy. Number of the Beast featuring their trademark mascot Eddie playing puppeteer to Satan himself. And even the single art to Run to the Hills has Eddie in a battle with the devil, with a crowd of demons or mutants or just weird lumpy things watching. For its time, you have to kind of consider how unorthodox something like this was, especially since not too far down the road was that whole Judas Priest suicide civil suit. Though the title track and Run to the Hills are fantastic songs, this record also has some just utterly infectious deep cuts as well, like the closing track, which is incredibly melodic and one of Iron Maiden's most epic finishes on any album. And then there is The Prisoner. I'm a free man! Just top-notch vocals and vocal harmonies all over this. I love the triumphant melody on the chorus here, and just the really head-banging riff and groove the track starts off with, which eventually glides into some throttling guitars and tempos like many other songs on this album and other Iron Maiden albums do. And then with 22 Acacia Ave, we have Iron Maiden sort of giving a really dreary depiction of an average English street, talking about a place that's very dark where everyone has their vice. Dickinson on this song sings specifically about prostitution. One in particular who suffers an unfortunate fate is sort of thrown into the meat grinder of the underground sex industry. There are moments on this record and other Maiden records where the band lyrically will toy with the idea of evil from a mythical or a figurative standpoint, but some of the band's most gritty and hard-hitting songs display that the biggest evils of all just can't be made up because they are in fact real life. Case in point, Run to the Hills, which is a metal song quite literally about the genocide of Native Americans by European settlers. Still, the title track on this LP seems to be a little more spiritual in nature, in that we have a protagonist who is suffering from memories or visions of what I think is a satanic ritual of some sort, and at the end of the song he seems to have been possessed, and Gangland seems to be some kind of weirdly violent and exaggerated world of mercenaries where just killing is completely legal and just rampant. It's complete chaos. So Iron Maiden on this record really does present us with a series of pretty trying and very morbid subject matters. Some of them feel like food for thought, others are a little more gory for the sake of being gory. Regardless, on this record, Iron Maiden solidify themselves as not just great musical songwriters, but storytellers too. As far as the sound of the music on this LP goes, it's not quite as hellish as I'm sure it once was when it originally dropped, but it certainly was for its time, and in retrospect, even with loads of bands today being heavier, louder, faster, more aggressive, I don't think this album has really lost any of its flavor. I still find this album to be incredibly grim and kind of extravagant melodically and a little operatic in the way that it dramatizes the situations discussed in the lyrics. And I still think a lot of the blazing guitar solos and the kind of trebly, distorted, brittle tone and the pounding drums and the prominent bass and the very tight performances have all held up pretty well. In my opinion, this is a stellar album. It's a significant LP for the musical movement it was a part of at this time. It is a pivotal album in the Iron Maiden discography and contains some of metal music's most important and enjoyable songs ever. I think you should give this record a listen if you haven't already. Definitely a metal classic worth talking about and revisiting if you haven't heard it in a long time. And yeah, that's it. You're the best. Anthony Fantano, Iron Maiden Transition. I love you. And have a nice day. Forever.